For those of us that were here last week, we were treated to a really wonderful talk from Michelle, in which Michelle shared some of her personal journey with Buddhism as well as other things. And last week, by means of introducing Michelle, I was rejoicing in Michelle's courage as well as other things. I was thinking, we'll be here tonight, and I get this opportunity to just say a couple of things. But I just really been thinking, Michelle, how anytime someone steps through those red doors for the first time, I believe that person takes a risk. They come into an unknown environment, they're looking perhaps for something, and I think that's not an easy thing for most of us to do. But I was reflecting on some of your journey and some of what you shared, and just sitting here tonight realising actually that the risk that you took when you came here on the back of some of your previous experience. And I don't want to rejoice in you tonight. I mean, there's so many things I could rejoice in: your capacity to be a friend, your generosity, so many things. But actually I just want to thank you for taking the risk that you took when you came into our centre the first time that you did. And I want to thank you for hanging in with our community. I know that you gain a lot from the Dharma, from being a part of our community, but our community gains a lot from your engagement with us. So thank you, Michelle, for hanging in with us.
Well, thank you, Dandachita, for that very generous introduction, I guess. Perhaps I better just quickly introduce myself. I'm an out and proud transgender woman. I've got 2 adult children and a wife of 6 years. We've been together a lot longer than that, 41 or something. So really kind of settled life. I teach biotechnology at Melbourne Uni, so that just kind of gives you a quick thumbnail sketch of me. I'm also a transgender activist, so that's probably enough. I'd like to start first by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here tonight. This was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty of it was never ceded. So I'm going to try and give a quick summary of Transgender 101, which we took rather an expansive kind of view of last week. I then want to move on to what the Dharma tells us about transgender people, which is not a lot of definitive stuff. There's a lot of stuff that, 3 years ago there wouldn't have been there wasn't hardly anything. Now there's starting to be gender affirming and gender critical interpretations of the stories that are in the Dharma. I'm largely going to leave them alone. I'm just going to quickly highlight over some key things for me. I'm then going to talk about modern context, so that most of the stuff that's around is in the Pali Canon, the modern context and modern commentaries by some significant Buddhist leaders, and then go on to talk about the position of transgender in modern modern Buddhist groups, with a particular reference to Triratna, and then talk about my experiences, both positive and negative, as a transgender person coming into this amazing Sangha. And Dandachita said it takes courage to walk through that door. For me, for those of you who heard the story last time, I walked through as a very damaged woman. I've been given a very transphobic response from my Tibetan Buddhist teacher, who I respected enormously. And so I came in a very damaged person, and I've been healed by the open-handed generosity that this centre has shown me. And, that particular bit of the ethical guidelines up there, generosity number 2, just overwhelms me at times. It's wonderful. And there's one supreme exponent of it sitting there on my left. So let's go on to try and do a quick guide to gender and being transgender. I guess I'm going to try and talk about gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity as the 4 key concepts. And I guess the quick one is sex is what obviously between your legs, and gender is in Western terms, what's between your ears, in your mind. In Buddhist terms, it might be there in your mind. So you know what anatomically is sitting between your legs, but you also know what's in your head. You have the sense that I am a man, I am a woman, boy or a girl, and that's very deeply embedded in us. Now, for most of you in the room, the gender, the voice inside your head that's telling you I am a man or a woman, matches exactly what's in between your legs. However, and transgender people would say that describes a cisgender person, where cis means literally on the same side. It's a Latin meaning on the same side. So your gender is on the same side as your sex. For a transgender person, they're not the same. So I was affirmed male at birth, anatomically male at birth. Now I've known forever that I was a woman, and I am therefore a transgender woman. My gender in my head is telling me something different to what's between my legs. I'll follow on to just sexual orientation and gender identity. So sexual orientation is the shorthand for this is sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, but your gender identity is who you go to bed as. And they're two different things and quite often get conflated and confused. So it's important to remember that, to hold on to that distinction. I think there's also a tendency, particularly with sex, to say, yes, but there's only two sexes and, you can't cross that line. Well, in fact, that's quite wrong biologically. I'm studied genetics in 1972, and there's quite a significant proportion of the population and we were told this then, that have what's called an intersex variation. An intersex variation means, and there's about 70 different ones, means that you're not wholly male or female, and that might be on the basis of chromosomes, it might be on the basis of anatomical differences that are different to conventional male or female, it may be on the basis of hormone levels, or it may be on the basis of physiology, which is largely physiological responses to hormone levels. So you might have normal hormones, but you're insensitive to the hormone in some way, in some part of your general being. So sex is definitely non-binary. It's not just male or female. There's this significant proportion of the population, 1.7%, is about the incidence of having red hair. So that gives you an idea of how common it is. Where are we going? None of the other things are binary. So gender is, when you're transgender, you can be a transgender man or a transgender woman, but you can also be non-binary, and people who are non-binary adopt a whole range of different descriptors for their gender, and or maybe even no descriptor, and essentially they're saying, I don't either feel wholly or partially male or female. So some of them are rejecting gender altogether, some of them saying, well, I'm a little bit trans, but I'm not wholly a trans woman, etc. Quite a complex area, and I'm not non-binary, so I don't understand. I'm very, very binary kind of girl. So I think that covers that. And of course sexual orientation, you can be attracted to men, attracted to women, and that might be the same sex or opposite sex, but you can also be attracted to people who are transgender and people who are non-binary. And, so the attracted to both men and women is described often as bisexual, but being attracted to any gender is described as pansexual. So there's this kind of whole complex dimension of different ways of expressing your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, gender identity. So just move on now. I think, hopefully that's clear. Yeah, everybody coping so far? I don't know that I am, but anyway, we'll keep going. Now we go on to a very difficult topic, which is very much a feature of the transgender world, and that is mental health. And so this comes with a trigger warning about suicide and other sort of stuff. And just the high level is that transgender people experience mental health problems at 10 to 20% of the broader population. And this just completely blows me away every time I have to say it. So what that means is that about 80% of the transgender population suffer either anxiety or depression or both, and about half of them will have attempted suicide at some stage in their lives. And that kind of hasn't really shifted over the last 5, maybe even 10, probably hasn't shifted over 10 years when the people have done surveys and it's been checked in Australia and so on. And people have inquired about this, the medical researchers have inquired about this somewhat, and they've recognised that it was originally thought that being transgender was a mental illness because of this problem, and it's not. It's what's been shown is that transgender people who are raised in a very accepting environment, and this is what you find with children now that can be raised in accepting environments because they exist, thank goodness, they have normal levels of mental health markers, They're very close to normal, if not better than normal. And, that says that once you take off, sort of suggesting that, saying that once you remove the levels of discrimination, the abuse, the kind of marginalisation and malignment that transgender people have experienced for decades and decades, then once you remove that, then that whole effect of having bad mental health will will dissipate. And with younger, the studies where it's dissipated entirely are in younger children, and so they don't have a long history of absorbing all this stuff. And where does this where I absorbed it from is God knows, but it's popular media. There's casual transphobia everywhere in popular media. So going back to films like Psycho in the 60s, the transgender person in movies, in plays, in radio, in TV, in books, and in the general news media has been portrayed at the best as an object of ridicule, a joke, and at the worst a psychopathic killer, as in Psycho. And really, that hasn't really changed enormously. There are some positive stuff about transgender people in the media and in film and TV and so on now, but still there's an overwhelming negative kind of stuff that's pushed out to you. And I'm wearing my Gender Whisperer t-shirt just to briefly... Oh God, I didn't press the button. How far are we in?
Okay, so it's almost 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
15.
So I got about half an hour, it's swallowing question time. Okay, so I'm wearing this Gender Whisperer t-shirt, and probably no one who's not in the community would know, but there was a story that came out, I think how long ago? It was about a year ago, where schools in New South Wales were asking for transgender peer support workers to go in and support transgender children who had been identified as transgender independently of the school, and the school wanted support. And so the News Corp world got hold of this, Daily Telly, Miranda Devine, etc., and they beat it up like crazy. It was shocking that these people were going in to convert normal kids into the transgender agenda. But, nothing, there was no relation to the truth. What Scott Morrison did was went on Ray Hadley's show in Sydney and coined the term gender whisperers to describe these people, to give that wrong impression that this is what they were doing. They were going out and converting children to being transgender. And nothing could be further from the truth. So this is just a visual reminder that the world is still like that. And, most... sort of over half newspaper articles in Australia are still about transgender people are still negative. Oh yes, I must say, there's 2 points I'd like to make. There's it's not a lovely quote, it's a shocking quote from an African American filmmaker called Marlon Riggs, which sums up how this kind of input, of the negative input from the media, leaves me. And Marlon Riggs, an African-American filmmaker who died in 1994 of AIDS, and he said, "It is necessary to constantly remind ourselves that we are not an abomination." And that's what this negative messaging kind of does to you, as it does to me as a transgender person. I shouldn't speak. I must say, you've heard one transgender person's story, you've heard one transgender person's story. You know, we each and every one of us are very different individuals. But that describes that internalised negative messaging that you pick up from all the stuff that you accumulate. And I've been accumulating it for over 60 years, so there's a lot of it there. And the other thing I wanted to touch on quickly was, some advice to people who want to be supportive, because that's often a question. And I've stolen this from another African American, this time a feminist lesbian, poet called Pat Parker, and it's just simply, she wrote a thing called, to the white person who wants to be my friend. This, I've said, is to the cis person who wants to be my friend, and it starts off, the first point is, forget that I'm trans. And the point of that is, you know, I don't want to be necessarily seen as a trans woman, although I accept the term, but I want to be seen as a woman. I am a woman. That's how I feel. That's the message that I've got inside my head or my heart, and that's why I want to be treated. And so paradoxically, the next point is never forget that I'm trans, because I've carried all that load of stuff from negative messages, and I carry that need to tell myself I'm not an abomination. And you need to bear that in mind when you're interacting with me, those shocking mental health statistics. All right, I've squandered a whole lot of time, but anyway, we'll move on. I guess trans and the Dharma. I think the perspective that I have is when the Buddha came on this earth and started teaching. He came down. He didn't come down in a situation where there were no trans people. He definitely came in a situation where there were trans people, and we know this because 4,500 years ago, so 2,000 years before the Buddha, was the first historical record of quasi-historical record of transgender people, and that's recorded in Hindu scripture. And it's essentially about a group of people who now have the status in India of a third gender. They only acquired it in 2017 or something, so they've had a long fight, haven't they? But you know, I guess they're men who live their lives as women, and they live their lives in a kind of a communal situation with a senior person, They're called hijras, a senior hijra as their mentor, and it's it is a religious kind of event. And they have a certain religious status in India and Hinduism. So, you know, when Buddha came along, he certainly knew transgender people. And, you know, the surprise to me is that there isn't a bit more about transgender people in the Dharma. You know, it's not, you know, it's a little bit of a surprise. But the thing that is rock solid in my opinion, although I've seen queer critical interpretations of this, so let's take it with a grain of salt, but in the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the Buddha's instructions to how ordained people should live their lives, the rules for monastics, in other words, there's a record of a monk on whom I'm going to try and quote it, on whom the sexual features of a female appeared overnight. These guys had the idea that gender was fluid. And the Buddha was asked, well, what should we do? You know, what should we do with this monk? And the Buddha said, look, let's start. The same number of rainy seasons apply, so the same seniority applies. The same teacher should apply to the person, but they should be transferred to a nunnery, and so live with the women, and they should be subject to the rules of women, nuns, which of course are much more strict than men because, Anyway, we won't go there. If you're interested in that question, read this book, Buddhism Beyond Gender. But the other side of the coin was there was a nun on whom the sexual features of a man appeared overnight, and the Buddha responded in exactly the same way. Same number of rainy seasons, same teacher, transfer to a monastery, and the rules of the monks apply. And so that says that there's a shining light, and discovering this was transformational for me when I had a very transphobic response from a Tibetan Buddhist teacher who said, what you're doing is wrong. Finding that said, no, the Buddha says you're cool. The Buddha says, if you were a monk, you could be a nun. That'd be perfectly acceptable. And that's was an enormous relief to me finding that. There's some writing attributed to Buddhaghosa, who's a 5th century current era kind of scholar in Buddhism. People probably know him better than I, and it's not absolutely certain it's Buddhaghosa. He did an analysis of this, and he said what? He said that the monk who was transferred into the nunnery must have been born with a little bit of good karma because he was reborn as a man. However, he must have had an enormous amount of negative karma for him to cause him to transition to a woman. And he said exactly the reverse about the nun. She was born with a little bit of bad karma that led to a rebirth as a female, and had an enormous amount of good karma that led her to be a male. And I think, although that story isn't analysed by Rita Gross in that book, it's indicative of a patriarchal view that sits in the Indian society, I guess, at the time. And I don't think it's inherent in the Buddhist. It's not inherent in the Buddhist teaching. That's the analysis that you can do. So we've strayed into women-men stuff. So I think what I should say, what I do want to say is, the Buddhism is said to be beyond gender. So the enlightened state is genderless. It's so they're perfectly matched for real non-binary characters. These guys. And I use the term advisedly, guys, because each and every one of the Buddhas that you see has one of the 32 marks of the great man or the Buddha. Number 10 is a well-retracted male organ. And the implication of that is enlightenment is said to be, it's necessary to do it from a male position. That's coming out, so you're necessary to be reborn as a male and you become enlightened from men. That has been debunked a lot, so don't get too worried about it. But I think what you find too in the stories of the Bodhisattvas is a lot of stories about transition across genders, but when they're headed in the direction of enlightenment, it's usually female to male, which is wonderful if you're a trans man and want a role model, but it's absolutely useless for me. And this was actually what my Tibetan teacher said to me: "Stop, you're going the wrong way." Kind of thing that was sitting in the back of his head, I'm sure. He didn't say exactly that, but I'm sure it was sitting there. And so what about me? And the slogan that people in this kind of minority area often adopt, and Indigenous people use this a lot, is you can't be what you can't see. In other words, you need a role model to follow to achieve whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think, that having that role model goes beyond the personal. It goes into the respect of people around you. If they can see what you're trying to be, and it's clear what you're trying to be, then they've got the ability to respect you more. And that's why I think role models are so important for particularly minority people, people of minorities. And so this brings me to my friends over here. So Avalokiteshvara, who's, I don't know if anybody doesn't know, but he's the guy on the right up at the shrine room, right of the shrine as you face it, up in the upstairs shrine room. He started out life in India as a male, and he transferred, when Buddhism travelled to China, he transferred to China as a male, but he changed his name, and his new name was Kuan Yin, which is various English iterations, and it's about the 4th century of the current era. And so on the right, there's a male Kuan Yin in the royal ease pose, and he was the version of Avalokiteshvara that hit China. And pardon me if I'm telling you stuff and I'm getting it slightly wrong, but this is the high-level thing. around the 8th century of the current era, what happened to Kuan Yin was the dominant presentation of Kuan Yin became female. There are still lots of male presentations of him. I saw one in Chinatown in the city just the other week, a very beautiful one, but they also had a female one in the shop. But she appeared around the 8th century of the current era, and that's obviously not an 8th century statue. That's a statue I bought in this century in Bendigo at the Chinese Museum. And Bendigo has a wonderful Chinese museum which has an extraordinary temple which has beautiful life-size marble statue of Kuan Yin. I won't ramble on too much more about Kuan Yin, but she is my model, and I did want to point out that there's a lot of symbolism always in statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and the key symbolism, of course, Avalokiteshvara and Amitabha belong to Buddha. The Avalokiteshvara and Kuan Yin belong to Amitabha's Buddha family, which is over in the corner near the coffee and tea. The picture is there. And there is a reason I'm wearing red, because red is the colour of that family of Buddhas, and it's the colour of compassion in Buddhism, at least in Tibetan Buddhism. And she's got some beautiful symbolism. She's got sitting on a lotus throne, and there's that family is said to be lotus born, although all Buddhists do have that, but I think there's a special relationship there. Up on the top knot, right up the top, there's a kind of a top knot on her, and that is meant to be a depiction of Amitabha, though this isn't a detailed enough, fine enough kind of representation to do that. But the two key symbols she has in her hands are in the right. There's a willow branch, and the willow branch is symbolism in China is to sweep away evil spirits. That's the function of the willow branch in her thing, and I really take that about sweeping away that whole sense that I'm an abomination, conquering all my obscurations, but particularly that one. It's kind of a strength. And in her hands, I think the golden vase has got various representations, but to me, it's holding the nectar of compassion. It's probably picked up from a traditional Tibetan Buddhist viewpoint. The male one that I saw in the city the other day had a golden vase, and it was in the figure's hand, and it was pointed downwards, spilling something out, and so spreading the nectar of compassion. The tagline for Avalokiteshvara and Kuan Yin's of all genders is they who hear the cries of the world, she who hears the cries of the world for the female. And that sums up what the Bodhisattva of compassion is all about, I guess. But the fact that this male Bodhisattva became a female, to me, is personally very significant. You could put a gender critical argument on it, but a queer critical argument on it. But for me, it's a really personal thing. I want to now move. I've got enough time, I guess. I now want to move into the whole question. Oh, sorry. There's one thing I wanted to say about the Dharma and Buddhism. What do modern Buddhist leaders say? What do modern Buddhist leaders say about transgender people? And so I'll start with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, and in about 2000 he's had a checkered career in commenting on LGBTI people and their rights, and it's the checkeredness of it really seems to devolve around whether it's okay to be LGBTI and a Buddhist, or whether it's just okay, whether LGBTI people deserve to have political rights and so on. And the first part, whether it's okay to be LGBTI and a Buddhist, seems to be up for grabs. And so he was meeting with these activists in San Francisco in about 2000, and what he did was brought along a treatise of Tsongkhapa, who was the 15th century founder of the tradition from which His Holiness is the head, His Holiness Dalai Lama is the head. And in it, it really... It's a teaching. There's a teaching in it that really says that sex should be only used for procreative capacity. It's very Catholic Church-like, and that any use of any other any other orifices, organs in sexual activity is totally out. And His Holiness did say, well, he wasn't sure that this was appropriate in the modern context, but he didn't think he could lead any change. So it's quite a negative view of the LGBTI community. So, of course, His Holiness is 84, and I think he was in his 70s at that point, 60s maybe, I don't know, somewhere around there, quite old, and has two very important functions in the Tibetan Buddhist community, which is an exile community. It is really a difficult gig to hold, and he has a spiritual function as the head of the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, but he has also a serious political function, and I think that all of those would be perhaps paying into that comment and his caution about it. It wasn't totally no, but it certainly wasn't very positive. This guy is His Holiness the 17th Karmapa, all right, we'll leave it at that. 17th Karmapa, and he's in this book, in fact, in a number of public pronouncements, he said LGBTI people are perfectly fine. They should have rights. They can be Buddhists. They're okay as long as they practice it properly. And then specifically about transgender, he specifically answered the question about transgender people. He said supports the idea that transgender people will be rights, and that transgender relationships are perfectly fine as long as they're based on real love and compassion, and not some sort of artificial lust or whatever, And so that's a perfectly good one. And the third leader I wanted to refer to is Thich Nhat Hanh, and Thich Nhat Hanh is, of course, a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist leader, and well respected. And he had a teacher who came to him in about 2003 and said, "I've transitioned." She just came along as a female, and he said, and the name of the person's Katrina Reed, and he said, she said, the only thing that Thich Nhat Hanh said to her was, "So we call you Katrina from now on, is that right?" And they just went on, So that's someone who's a teacher in a very significant lineage, and the leadership of that lineage says, yes, it's fine, we'll accept you can transition and we'll accept you as a teacher. So, trans people and Dharma centres. I think for transgender people, anywhere where there's gendered activity is an issue. So, witness bathroom bloody bills and battles, if you know anything about what's going on politically in the US, is shocking. But anywhere there's gendered activity, and in Dharma centres, Triratna particularly, there's two areas of gendered activity. One is study groups, and the other is, of course, retreats. And the gendered retreat can be single gender in Triratna, or even with a mixed gendered retreat, you've got the question of bathrooms and sleeping facilities. And so, that's the level of friction that comes up for a transgender person. And it can be as much about the apprehension of the transgender person as any reality, but it is an issue. And it's particularly strong and live issue in Triratna, which is a very LGBTI-friendly Dharma Sangha, a Sangha, and it, the estimates of it are, there was a survey done by an organisation called Intercooler, and around various attitudes to problems, but essentially the demographics coming back for it said that 4% of the people responded that they were non-binary. So the survey was 400 odd people, so we're getting 16 people identifying as non-binary, which is quite a significant proportion, the general population. So, and the implication would be if there's 4% non-binary, there'll be quite a percentage of binary trans people as well. So you might get up to 8% being transgender in Triratna. Mainly you're focused in the UK. The main respondents were order members of Mitras, and some general, but it was 80% order members plus Mitras. So there's a very significant population of trans, particularly in the UK and Europe. And a couple of order members run a Triratna closed Facebook group and a Triratna transgender secret Facebook group. for transgender people interested in Triratna to converse and talk. And in that group there's 10 non-binary order members, there's 2 trans men order members, and there's 3 trans women order members. So that's it's quite a so there's quite a population of us in Triratna. I'm not going to talk about that. Where am I going? Sorry. Lost my way. Okay, so I was going to switch. So that's just a general picture of Triratna, a general picture of where Dharma centres experience issues with transgender people. I'm going to talk about my experience of Melbourne Buddhist Centre. And the first thing I want to say is I've been met with open-handed generosity from the minute I walked through that door, literally the minute. And first person I met was Linda, second person I met was Danta Cheetah, and it's been all good from there in terms of the general interaction. I've been well accepted by the women's study group. I've seen absolutely no hint of problems, and it's been in retreats where I've seen issues arise. But by and large, they don't look very big, I guess, in an objective sense, but they've had a big effect on me. One thing I did want to say is, gosh, what time is it? Just about run out of time, haven't I?
You've got 10 minutes, Michelle.
Thank you. That's very kind. I hope we don't keep you all up. I think I'd like to just talk about, I really would like to talk about my story about the celebration of the Parinirvana here this year. And so when I finally transitioned, which was the end of 2017 fully, so I transitioned at work in that December 2017 and changed my name completely and, did whatever. There was a real sense of loss of the male person who'd been keeping Michelle safe all those years, 60 years of, hiding behind this male mask, and it was being thrown away. And it felt like I was killing someone off, and it really did. And I had a great sense of loss, and I didn't know what to do with that sense of loss. And I missed the Parinirvana in 2018, but this year I went along, and there's a lovely little ceremony in the Parinirvana ceremony, puja, where people are asked to write down the name of someone that they've lost during the year, and their own name, of course, and they can then light a candle, and the leader of the puja will read out that, so-and-so has lost a friend called so-and-so, and they're lighting the candle for them. And so I wanted to mark the passing of Michael, so I wrote Michelle, Michael. I'm going, what the hell's the relationship? How do I express that? And Appada here kind of pressed me for the relationship, and then he backed off. He thought, I don't know what he thought, but you could see I was having difficulties. And then when I did come to the lighting candle, he said, Michael, who's known to Michelle, who was known to Michelle. And that kind of defused that whole thing for me, because I was embarrassed about talking about that in that sacred ceremony. I felt, intruding in it if I was going to make a big fuss about it was my other male self, and I didn't want to do that. And that was handled with aplomb and dignity and everything. I think we'll move on to retreats. I guess in most of the retreats I've been to, I've been mollycoddled by Danta Cheetah here largely, but I've been asked who I want to share with, and that's the reality, but who I want to share with, but she's not always around. And been shown the facilities and helped to feel comfortable using the female facilities. And, and many check-ins, how are you going, Michelle? Is everything all right? Making sure that I am coping with everything. But it's not been true of all retreats, and I think that's something that ought to be considered. There's been several negatives, and I'm going to talk about them in general terms. I'm not going to identify anybody. I think that's very unfair. I've talked to a couple of people involved, and I'm absolutely convinced there's no malice in anything that happened, but the negative effect on me was bad. So the first one, I was brushing my teeth in the ladies. The conversation next to me was I was being kept awake by another woman, kept awake all night by a light outside our dorm. Other woman said, yes, wasn't it shocking? first woman turns to me and says, well, Michelle, you wouldn't know about that because you'd be sleeping in the men's facilities. And that kind of really threw me. You know, here I am in the women's, dressed as a woman and brushing my teeth, and why would I be sleeping in the men's facility anyway? It's kind of in that category. These first ones all sit in that category of please forget that I'm trans, you know, and just treat me as a woman. Someone just referred to me as a man, and then you know, and that's a casual sort of thing. Guys, man, you know, that can be common, but then tittered about it. So like there was some sort of joke in there, and that really threw me. But I was in a group of women. We were talking about women's groups. There are a particular subset of women's groups who don't accept transgender women and exclude them totally. And at the end of the conversation, someone said, oh, look, a woman said to me, look, I don't mind men pretending to be women at all. And, you know, that kind of hit me right in the mind, heart. And then I encountered someone who I really hadn't met properly before, and we had a bit of a conversation, and then I got 4 questions. And they were all kind of making it obvious. The first one, I guess, that they hadn't forgot that I'm trans. The first question was, how other women treat you in the Dharma group. The second was, are you sleeping in women's dorms or men's dorms? And again, I kind of find that really weird. And then, are you taking hormones, and have you had bottom surgery? And I find the last 2 questions, and most trans people would do this, very invasive and offensive. You know, it's a very difficult thing to talk about to someone you don't know, someone who you do know well. Yes, perhaps someone who you might be interested in sleeping with, they might want to know, but otherwise it's not really anybody's business. And I guess these things threw me off a bit. God. You know, under the never forget I'm trans, I think I've been at a retreat where we did talk about we did repeated sessions where we had to describe how various longings or yearnings lived in you. And at that point in my life, none of those longings or yearnings lived in me. And there were things like family, love, acceptance, belonging, and there was a whole 25 of them. I looked at the whole list and I said, none of those are happening for me. I don't believe they'll ever happen for me at that point, because I was having issues with my children, my wife, and my job, in terms of acceptance, in terms of belonging, in terms of fitting in terms of feeling loved. And that repeated we repeated and repeated and repeated those kind of discussions and reflections on those, and I was really driven into the ground by that, and ended up having severe, what's called suicide ideation on the way home. I won't go into it any more. There's a negative ending there, so let's get into the positive ending. The reason I'm telling you all this is I want, it's not to whinge or moan about myself, and I do know that I have to tackle some of that stuff in myself. I have to get on top of needing to constantly tell myself I'm not an abomination, and that's part of the story. But, I want for the next person and the next person and the next transgender person for the path to be easier. That's my aim. And so, practical steps. For the MBC, I'd really want a formalised instruction to retreat leaders, trans and gender diverse people, and reflections can be more broad than us, but, I'd want to be a section on us. And I guess, the good features should be incorporated in that. So, asking who you'd be comfortable sharing a room with, helping, explain the bathroom facilities and make sure that you feel that you belong in the ones that you feel comfortable in, and having a signal to, just maybe check in with them a little bit more than the average person, the average maybe newcomer, I don't know. And I think that would need to note sensitivity to issues around belonging, which is a particularly important point, but the really, the non-inherent existence of self one, the innate story, if you are doing teachings in that, then people with minority stresses of all sorts who are struggling with their identity may be sensitive to that, but particularly transgender diverse, I can speak from. I won't go into there. The other thing was, I think, if we can increase the cultural, you start with cultural awareness, you move through cultural sensitivity, cultural proficiency to cultural safety as a group for minority groups, and that goes across, that's a model from racial minorities, but it applies to transgender, it applies to disabled, it applies if you're trying to be inclusive of anyone. And tonight all I can do is just start on that cultural awareness journey, but, the group has to. And don't sit as a bystander if you hear any of these kinds of things. Convert to an upstander, which is a new word that I learnt the other day, which means you're prepared to intervene and say, no, Michelle's a woman, of course she's going to sleep in women's dorms, or she's going to, be in the women's bathrooms, or she's not pretending to be she's not a man pretending to be a woman, she's a woman. So that would be what I'd like to hear from an upstander, so not to have to sit and quietly internalise and say what the hell's going on, but to have someone stand up for me. For me, I need to establish more resilience, constantly remind myself that I'm not an abomination, and gradually let go of the need to do that. And this will take time, and I need to keep practicing. Last time I emphasised at the end that my practice is really important to me in my transgender journey, that mindfulness of breathing, reminds me that the stuff that's arising in my mind is transient and will change from moment to moment. And it helps me maintain a calm equilibrium. The Metta enables me to talk to people like ScoMo in my head and say, I can give you loving kindness, I can show you compassion. And that's really important because there's so many people you can be just angry and mad at, and that's not productive. I've run way over time. I have one final parting shot, and that's why should you welcome trans and gender diverse people into your sangha? We're just troublemakers, really. We're not easy. We're not easy territory, and that's what all that stuff says. And the ethics part, the open-handed generosity that you show to everyone, that a bodhisattva shows compassion to everyone. The person that looks like the axe murderer on the Sydney Road tram is just as much worthy of, and ScoMo is just as much worthy of her compassion as our friends. That's one thing, but even more broadly, from my point of view, I'm very grateful that you do show that open generosity. But diversity in an organisation, in organisations, has shown to improve the organisation, and this has been largely driven in the corporate world. But one of the key factors, I think the important thing for a religious group to embrace diversity is that organisations that are diverse and inclusive are shown to be much more innovative. And I think when you're exploring the Dharma, having different, this is a logical thing, having different kind of viewpoints, having a diversity of approaches to it is really important, because the Dharma is incredibly complex, really difficult to get your head around. And having people who think differently to you is really, really critical might be the critical step that enables you to progress beyond where you are. And I think that's what diversity will add to any religious organisation, and particularly a sangha. And so I'll stop there. And it's diversity, of course, across all the dimensions of diversity that you can imagine. And I think my perception of Triratna is that it does have some diversity in it, but you could have more. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.